Subscribe to get the news the legacy media won't tell you and only the Daily Signal can bring to you.
Travis Bowman is an author, producer, and descendant of Peter Francisco. Thanks so much for joining the Daily Signal today.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Before we delve into the book and the miniseries, I'm glad that we're not standing because you'd be towering over me. And I promise this will come up later in the conversation. But how tall are you, Travis?
Well, I 6'6" in my younger years. Come down a little bit in my older age.
I hear that happens.
That happens, right? You know, but yes, Peter Francisco himself was 6'6", and in his day, he was a foot taller than the average man. So.
Taller, wow.
So if you go to Williamsburg, you know, right here in Virginia, and you go just walk through their old houses, you see their beds are small. They're not big beds that we see today. So you go to any historic home back then, in today's world, we think, how these people are short. And that, I mean, in his day, he was like Shaquille O'Neal. That's what I would say.
Yeah.
He was like, you know, a 7-foot guy in his world.
Which is why he had the name, the Virginia Giant.
The Virginia Giant, that's right. Or the Hercules of the Revolution. They're like, who is this freak of nature, you know? So, yeah.
Well, you are a 7th generation descendant. You're somebody who's passionate about his life and telling the story. Share with our audience more about Peter Francisco, who he was, and why it is that you are so drawn to making sure that Americans and other people across the world know about him.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating story of rich in American history. I mean, truly, he's considered one of our founding fathers. Anybody who was instrumental in the birthing of our nation lands in that category. But his life begins in the Azores, and most people don't know where the Azores are. They're kind of like Hawaiian Islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, about 1,000 miles off the coast of Portugal. They're Portuguese islands. So Peter himself, you know, Portuguese, and Portuguese people are not known for being tall. They're not, still to this day. So here you have this little kid born in the Azores, kidnapped by pirates, dropped off in Virginia, not in South Africa, Brazil, or think of a million other places on the planet that pirates would have dropped him off or could have, but in Virginia at that moment in time. So what we know is he was dropped off in Hopewell, Virginia. There's a huge monument with a head bust.
Okay, how old was he at the time?
He was 5 years old. So he's dropped off in 1765. June 23rd, to be exact, June 23rd, 1765. And next thing you know, we see that Patrick Henry's uncle takes him in, kind of like a indentured servant. They knew he wasn't African. They didn't know where he's from. He's a little kid. And so he ends up serving on Patrick Henry's uncle, Judge Anthony Winston's plantation, which it was a big plantation out in Virginia. If you go out in Buckingham County, matter of fact, Buckingham County today, I was just there a couple days ago, but they're in their administration building, their auditorium is named after Peter Francisco. They have a beautiful portrait painting hanging in there. But anyway, in his day, Judge Anthony Winston has this huge plantation. He's working there, and he grows to be a giant, a 6'6", foot taller than the average man giant. And at that moment in time, 1776, when the fight for arms and freedom. Do we stay loyal to the King of England and continue to deal with the Stamp Act and not being able to actually have a voice in what's going on in the colonies, or do we take up arms and fight? And now Patrick Henry makes that famous speech. Peter Francisco was there with Judge Anthony Winston when Patrick Henry says, I don't know about you all, but give me liberty or give me death. And most people don't know that what Patrick Henry was saying was, look, British troops are coming. Our arms and all of our gunpowder that's locked up in a church in Williamsburg, they're coming. They're going to hang us all for even meeting here at St. John's Church. So give me liberty or give me death. And Peter Francisco was there.
Amazing, amazing. So before we talk more about his role in the founding in America, was he ever able to reconnect with family in the Azores? Or do we know more about how the kidnapping happened?
No. Well, in fact, he never knew that he was from the Azores.
Oh,
and so
okay.
200 years later, it's Dr. John Manahan from the University of Virginia, so right here, you know, great Virginian, as a professor, was over in the Azores doing some research for a project, and he knew the story of Peter Francisco. And so he's just looking through archives, and he comes across a birth record, which I've seen many times. I've been over the Azores many times. But this birth record of a family, looking for a name, Peter Francisco, but a little Pedro Francisco, a birth record, but no death record. Because obviously in those books by a priest that's saying, I baptized this little kid here. Later, they would say, well, so-and-so is deceased, and this is the date that he passed away. Well, this little boy, Pedro Francisco, there is no death record. And so in 1960, that was when the Portuguese community in particular rallied around and said, this is our giant. Our giant hero came from the Azores. And so there's actually 5 monuments in the U.S. today. One, and there's a 6th one over in the Azores that stand in honor of him. But 3 of the 5 monuments in the U.S. were built by the Portuguese because they have taken him in as one of their own, you know.
Amazing. Okay, so let's go back. So on the plantation.
Yeah.
What happens next? Blacksmith?
So what we know in history is that he was a blacksmith. We also see that he falls in love with a girl named Susanna, who she's betrothed to a wealthy Virginian plantation owner, but she's like, I don't want to marry that guy. I want to marry the big strapping, handsome hunk of a dude. So true story. I mean, real story. But we see that he goes off to fight in the 10th. He signs up with the 10th Virginia Regiment in October of 1776. And so we see him fighting all through the American Revolution. He's there from the beginning to the end. So some of the early battles, for those that love history and love the battles from the American Revolution, but he was in Brandywine. He was at Fort Mifflin, which half the men lost their lives there. He was at Monmouth in New Jersey. And so the monuments that you do see in his honor are typically around in those states. But then we see he was at Stony Point, which was, he was handpicked by George Washington for 20 elite commandos, we would call the Navy SEAL of today, or the Army Rangers of the day. And so George Washington picks him along with 19 other guys to take, in the middle of the night, take a fortress from the British. And so he's in that engagement. He's wounded, takes a 9-inch gash in his stomach. He's left for dead. He ends up being left for dead twice during the whole American Revolution, wounded 6 times. Should have been dead. Like, for all account, any other soldier, if it was me, like the first time I got a musket ball in my leg, I'd be like, I'm out. I'm done. Have fun with that, But you see, he survives the entire American Revolution and continues to fight and goes back into battle. It's crazy.
Do we know from history what was his motivation? Why did he keep going back?
Well, that's a really good question. And I mean, the speculation is this little kid knew what freedom was, and it's ripped from him. So, like I said, he wasn't a slave per se on the plantation, Judge Anthony Winston's plantation, but there weren't any records to say he was a slave. So I guess the point, or an indentured servant, sorry. So an indentured servant would be after 7 years, you're free, right? You've served your time, and now you're a free man. There was no record to say that he was a slave or indentured servant. So we don't really know exactly what he was. But I always say is, because no one knew who his parents were, he wasn't white Anglo-Saxon of his day, he really kind of fit in the slave narrative of his day. There wasn't paperwork to say he was a slave, but the fact is he most likely was probably treated more like a slave. So when the American Revolution came, I'm sure to your point of his motivation, it was, I know what it was like to be free at one point in my life. I don't know who my parents are. I don't know. But this new country that everybody's talking about, that great idea, I'm behind that. And so I think being there at Patrick Henry's speech, that famous speech at St. John's Church, that fired him up to go fight. So I think that was the motivation.
And George Washington knew him as well.
Yeah, so George Washington's story is that he was 6'2". You got Peter Francisco standing,
4 inches
taller, and that day was, significant. So, yeah, I mean, people saw George Washington as a leader because of his height and obviously his resume of fighting the French and Indian War and so on. But then you look at Peter, and he's even taller, and so now what's interesting about Peter Francisco is that later in the war, George Washington offers him a commission to become an officer, and so lead some men. But he didn't know how to read or write. And so historically we see that he turned the commission down, and he remained just a private soldier his entire time because he didn't know how to read. If George Washington said, here, move the men here, and here's your orders, he didn't know how to read that. He didn't know how to respond back. So what we see after the war is he went to school so that he could earn the hand of marriage of Susanna. So chivalry was not dead in those days, and certainly he lived that up, lived up to that. But yeah, we see that he actually goes and gets an education and lives a long life. And
I'm going to ask you about Susanna in a moment, but from what I also understand is Washington had a special sword made for him. So obviously there was a deep amount of respect that Washington had for Peter.
Yes. For those that know, that geek out on the American Revolution, there was the Northern Campaign and then the Southern Campaign. And so for those that maybe not geek out on it, if you've watched the movie The Patriot that Mel Gibson produced, it starts with the Southern Campaign, with the burning of Charleston, South Carolina. So what we see is, by this point, Peter Francisco is famous in the Southern Campaign. This would be 1780. So American Revolution has been going on for 4 years now. 1780, we see that he's militia. And so he comes into battle there. And so what the sword that you're talking about was the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in Greensboro, North Carolina. And that would have been March 15, 1781. The story is that 2 days before the battle starts, that he's a huge sword is delivered to him that was a 6-foot broadsword, which, by the way, I brought a pamphlet. There's a monument in Greensboro to this day that stands in honor of where he swung this massive broadsword. And there's a plaque that says, Peter Francisco rendered himself likely the most famous private soldier with his very own broadsword here at this battle. And a pamphlet that was printed in 1910, I brought that so we can look that over here, but it talks about the 6-foot broadsword in the pamphlet that was printed.
And was that the battle
115 years ago was that
wasn't he able to injure or kill a large number himself of British soldiers?
It was 11 British, and so the
11.
monument shows 11 stones high.
Okay.
So that's I mean, you think of 11 British are killed on the battlefield.
Right. By one man.
Yeah. And it was eyewitness accounts that validated that later on after the battle, and
Okay. We'll go from war to love.
Yeah, war to love. That's right. Yes.
So
for the female audience, we completely lost them. So now we're bringing them back. Right? Now there's a love story.
So tell us about the love story, because obviously that plays a big role in your book.
It does. I mean, so as I was unraveling the story, there's been about a half a dozen books that have been written before my book, and so I read those and then built my story and fleshed my out. I don't know. There's been many other books that have been written about Peter and really truly fleshed out the love story like I did. And so that's certainly one of the things that I was looking at. What historically do we know about her? Like I said, she was betrothed to George Carrington, which Carrington is still a prominent name in Virginia. But she's betrothed to George Carrington, but she's like, in real life, you see, she's like, I don't want that. I don't want that guy's money. I don't want any of that. I want the big strapping guy, Peter Francisco, which is crazy. I mean, so you could tell that she's a little bit feisty. She's like, She's going against the grain of society, and which I think is awesome. I love those guys. It's a Romeo Juliet type of story, right? So what we know is, in real life, Peter Francisco fights for 3 years, 1776 to 79, and then he comes back, and Judge Winston wants to treat him like a slave again. And so an argument breaks out, and he throws him out of the plant, says, get off my plantation. This is a true story. So as I'm unraveling this, I'm like, this is just epic, I'm thinking Braveheart, I'm thinking big, movie. So what we see is that he ends up going and living with the Anderson family, Susanna's family. And so I'm like, oh, this is great. Like, there's got to be a Christmas ballroom scene, there's dancing, there's festivity around crowd. Like, this is awesome. So that's what I wrote in my novel. I just kind of like taking the literary license where we don't know.
Sure.
This is Christmas time. There's obviously festivities, and they're falling in deeper in love. But what we then see, of course, he goes back into battle. And so what I speculate is he asked for her hand in marriage. Her father, James Anderson, who, again, prominent Virginian in that time, but says, absolutely not. Who are you? Like, what? How can you provide for my daughter? George Carrington's the guy. We've already made that deal, And so he's like, okay, well, screw it, And so he goes back into battle. That's what we see, is that he then fights in South Carolina and then North Carolina. But that's all speculation on that regard. But what we know is after the war, they do marry, after he goes and gets an education. So that's what makes it really, really fascinating. If you stop and think about it, you're like, this big giant guy who's kidnapped, and then he, doesn't have an education, but he ends up going to school with little kids so he can earn the hand of Susanna Anderson.
When did you first start to learn about being a descendant of Peter Francisco? Was this as a young boy?
Really good question, because we haven't talked about this. So in 1976, Peter Francisco was on a stamp. And my family, being descendants of Peter Francisco, my grandmother loved to tell stories. And so in the 70s, when I was a little kid, there was just chatter about him being on a stamp in the post office in Culpeper, Virginia. That's where my grandparents lived. The post office gave us the big poster, here's the stamp of Peter Francisco. So there was chatter about that, but I didn't know the whole story. And it wasn't until I moved to North Carolina that, and that was about 20 years ago, that my grandmother said, hey, you should go visit that monument in Greensboro. And I was like, I remember the stamp. I remember that. I knew he was a giant, but what did he do? I knew nothing. I mean, I didn't know about the Azores. I knew none of that. So now then to go to the Azores multiple times and meet with the president of Portugal. I was knighted by the king of Portugal 5 years ago for all this whole story and unraveling it. And, it's just been absolutely riveting what God's done just as I'm getting out and just being faithful.
What does the rest of your family say
as
you've made all these discoveries? I mean, it's just tremendous, right?
Oh, it's been just wild, I mean, the whole family has been very engaged in telling the story. And there's a lot of descendants of Peter Francisco today. He was married 3 times. His first wife passed away after 2 children. Then he remarries and 4 more children. And she passes away. And we see that then he marries a 3rd time later in life. And she had 6 children. So he adopts them. They all took on the last name of Francisco. So technically there was 12 children with, all those descendants. And so, I've interacted with descendants of Peter Francisco all across the country, as you can imagine today. They've heard the stories through the years. And so that's been a lot of fun. But even my immediate family, they've been riveted. So
you mentioned 1976. Of course, we have another big anniversary coming up in 2026, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Obviously, hopefully a momentous occasion for our country to celebrate and bring out the patriotism that many of us have. Do you have any plans to make sure that his story is known more widely among school kids to adults?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think this is the perfect story to unravel the American Revolution and educate the next generation. This is not, this is not the stuffy old guy with a wig on. This is like this, handsome, giant, muscular guy in a love story. So it's a great way to educate Americans on the American Revolution. And so through my years of getting out and telling this story, I met a guy in Hollywood, Brian Patrick Wade, who people would know him from Big Bang Theory and a number of different television shows, the Guardian movie with Kevin Costner and different things. But he and I have been collaborating. He's my business partner. And so we're now bringing the novel here into a 9-episode miniseries. And so our passion is to bring this, alive to, to the silver screen, as they say, and unravel the American Revolution and really, truly, Forbes magazine says that 83% of Americans don't even understand the American Revolution. And obviously we see that in this world today more than ever, the woke ideology that's out there. We live in a world where the American flag has become an offensive symbol and statues are being torn down and our history is being rewritten. Brian and I want to take the story and go, let's educate Americans on the biblical foundation, the rich heritage we have, all through the eyes of a giant hero, a God-ordained real hero. There are monuments out there. He's on a stamp in 1976. Like, this guy is a real, legitimate hero. Let's educate you on the American Revolution. So that's our passion for 2026.
Well, thank you for doing that. So tell us more about the details. Obviously, people can buy the book today. Yeah. When is the miniseries coming? Are there things that our audience can do to support your work, make sure that it's widely distributed?
Yeah. No, it's great. And the book is called LUSO. So for those of you watching this, you see on the front cover LUSO, but if you're listening, LUSO is a prefix that means a person of Portuguese descent. So I've already unraveled that he was from the Azores, Portuguese Islands. But LUSO.tv is where you can go watch our short film. So we've got a 9-minute short film on there. You see my business partner, Brian Patrick Wade, bringing Peter to life and swinging a big 6-foot sword and all that. But it's really a proof of concept of what we have here and what our passion is to produce the first episode here in 2025 and then be releasing that in 2026 and do a similar business model as The Chosen, and that is release it for free, let people watch it for free, educate Americans. But then the pay it forward model is what we want to use. And like, hey, if you watch it, it obviously costs money to produce this, and so pay this forward. So we're talking with investors right now, and we've obviously before the election it was a little challenging talking with people who want to invest in a project like this, but now the election is behind us, and I think we're in a great place to celebrate our nation's 250th anniversary. And I think there's investors out there that want to get behind us. And so we're out there talking with those types of investors about this project. And we've also collaborated. I will say this: we've also collaborated with Turning Point USA, which would be Charlie Kirk and his organization. They've been great to work with, and so we'll be working with influencers like Tucker or Candace Owens, those types of influencers to drive people to watch our first episode on our website. And then as it builds momentum, then obviously you'll see it on Amazon and Netflix. But just like The Chosen, it took some time to actually build that following before you'd start to see it on different streaming platforms. So.
That's fantastic. Again, the website is LUSO.tv. We'll be sure to include a link in the description of the show notes so that it's easy for you to click through to do that. Travis, one final question for you. You obviously are, I can sense you're passionate about history and telling this particular story, but why in this day and age when we seem so divided as a country and, there's so many issues that and challenges that we face in our daily lives, why is it important to remember what happened at our nation's founding?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ronald Reagan said it well, that we're only one generation away from losing our freedoms. And, never would I have imagined, I'm 51, never would I have imagined that we'd see a day where statues are being ripped down and the rewriting of history in our history books. And it's just unbelievable. I was just meeting with a board of trustees from Washington and Lee University, and he said for 10 years they fought to keep the name Washington in the university name. They spent $2 million to protect George Washington's name there at the university. That's the world we live in. Like I said, the American flag is becoming an offensive symbol in our own country, not in our own country. And so that's why I'm passionate. Like, there are men who are willing to lay it all on the line for the freedoms that we enjoy 250 years later. And when I was a kid, my dad worked for the Defense Department here in D.C., and we lived in Germany when I was a young kid in the early 80s. So I went to Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. If you're familiar with Checkpoint Charlie, the Berlin Wall was up, and guards stood there to keep people in East Germany. And as a kid, it was so obvious to me that there was a difference between tyranny versus freedom. And we're one generation away from seeing that same garbage. Our minds can't fathom that. We're like, nah, that would never happen in America. Like, no. I've seen it in our day. And when I was a kid, we weren't allowed to go to the Eastern Bloc of Europe. Today, all that's, my wife and I've been to Hungary and Poland and all those countries today. But back then, when I was a kid, you couldn't go there. You couldn't travel. And those people were locked in. They couldn't go to a free country. It was crazy, you know, when you stop and think about it.
It is so truly. Yeah.
The freedoms that we enjoy today, we need to be reminded of it.
We do. And I think as a father myself with 3 kids, I mean, it is so critically important to make sure that next generation does understand, because it's so quickly we could lose that freedom and all of the things that we do cherish. Travis Bowman, again, the book is called LUSO. Thank you for joining the Daily Signal. We look forward to seeing the miniseries and following your work closely in the future.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It was an honor. It was a privilege. Thank you.